There's a moment right before something turns deadly, where it still feels completely normal. A conversation, a walk with someone you thought you already knew. Nothing about him feels dangerous. He isn't hiding himself for acting strange. If anything, he's the kind of person you would trust without thinking twice about. And that's exactly what makes this case so disturbing. Because the man walking beside her that day was one of Russia's most prolific serial killers, Alexander Pichushkin. A man who had been killing for years, right under everyone's nose. A man who didn't just take the lives, he actually kept track of them, like moves in a game. And somehow, he kept getting away with it. If you've been around the channel for a little while, you actually might recognize that name. I briefly talked about him in a previous video, titled A Code Written in Blood, where we looked at real-life killers who operated on their own set of rules, their own twisted versions of a code. And in that video, I touched on Alexander as one of the more extreme examples. Someone who turned killing into something structured, almost calculated. But after that video, a lot of you wanted a deeper look into who he really was. So in today's video, we're going to dive into that. We're going to break down who Alexander Pichushkin really was. How he managed to operate for so long without being stopped. How some victims survived him and were ignored. How the system failed to stop him more than once. And how towards the end, it almost feels like he wanted to be caught. Now, if you're new here, welcome. I'm Cody, and this is KodiAfterDark, where we dive into real cases, unsettling stories, and the things that don't quite sit right, even long after they're over. So, when you're ready, grab a light, and let's step into the dark together. Before Alexander Pichushkin ever meant anything, before the headlines or the bodies started showing up in the woods, he was just another kid up in Moscow. Born in 1974, Alexander was raised by his mother in a small, cramped apartment, in a part of the city that many people felt stuck in. His father wasn't around, he had left early in his life, which meant most of his childhood was shaped by two people. His mother and his grandfather. And for a while, there was nothing that really stood out. He wasn't some isolated outcast from the very beginning. He talked to people. He even made friends. By most accounts, he seemed normal. There was one place that kept showing up in his life, though. A place that, at the time, meant something completely different. Just a park. A short walk from his home sat Bittsevsky Park. And I'm probably going to butcher that name at least once in this video, so bear with me. Bittsevsky Park is a massive stretch of forest cutting through the city. And to most people, it was an escape. Somewhere to walk, to think, or to get away from everything. Families went there, friends met there, people played games, and talked for hours. And for Alexander, it became a part of his everyday life. But somewhere in that childhood, something changed. When he was still young, Alexander was playing on a swing at that park. Something completely normal. But at one point, he fell off that swing, hitting the ground hard. And for a moment, it seemed like nothing serious. He reportedly even laughed it off, but as he got back up, the swing came back towards him and struck him directly in the head. There was no dramatic scene with screaming or crying. There was no immediate sense that anything was actually seriously wrong. But later on, it would be suggested that the impact may have caused damage to his brain, specifically in the area linked to impulse control, emotion, and restraint. But at the same time, that explanation isn't even a clean answer. Because honestly, people suffer head injuries like that more than we'll ever know, and they don't all go on to become killers. Now, what is clear is that after that moment, Alexander wasn't quite the same, and the shift wasn't instant. It didn't just happen overnight. But slowly, the kid who once found it easy to connect with people started pulling away. He started becoming more withdrawn, more irritable, way quicker to anger, and at school, that change didn't go unnoticed. He started getting bullied relentlessly, and that kind of thing doesn't just stay in the classroom. It builds up, and it sits with you. And over time, it starts to shape how you see everyone around you. Eventually, his mother made the decision to move him into a different school. One meant for children who were struggling, hoping that it would help. But instead, it seemed to isolate him even more. He was struggling to form real connections, struggling to feel like he fit in anywhere. So while other people his age were building friendships and figuring out who they were, Alexander was becoming more distant and disconnected. That is, until one person stepped in, his grandfather. Alexander's grandfather became one of the only real constants in his life. Someone who gave him attention, structure, and something to focus on. It was actually through him that Alexander was introduced to something that, at the time, felt like it might actually save him. The game of chess. At first, it was just a game, a way to pass time with something to focus on, but very quickly it became more than that. And he was good at it, really good. For the first time, he had something that gave him a sense of control, a sense of recognition. This was making people pay attention to him, and that feeling stuck. He started playing more often, not just at home, but out in the park, sitting across from older players, learning their skills, and even winning against them, proving to himself that he could be better than the people around him. And for a while, that seemed to be enough, until that changed too when his grandfather passed away. And that hit him hard. The one person who had grounded him, who had given him direction, was gone in the blink of an eye. And whatever stability he had left started to crumble. He moved back in full-time with his mother. He started drinking more and withdrawing from everyone, losing whatever connection he still had to the world around him. And that feeling he once got from chess, that sense of control, of being seen, and being something, started to fade. And in its place, something else started to grow. Something a whole lot darker. So for a while, nothing happened. His life just continued. Alexander kept working his job, stacking shelves at a local supermarket, moving through the same routines, blending into the background like he always had. But underneath that, something was building. The anger, the isolation, and this growing need to feel something, literally anything, was becoming stronger than the life he was living. And eventually, those thoughts stopped being just thoughts. By 1992, he had already started imagining it. Not just physically hurting someone, but actually killing them. And somehow, in his mind, that thought didn't feel insane. It felt like a possibility, like something that he needed to try. There was one other person that he felt connected to, someone he had spent time with playing chess in the park. And for reasons that only made sense to him, he believed that connection meant something more. That maybe this was someone who would understand him. So Alexander came up with a plan. He invited him out to the park and framed it like any other day. Just another game. Afterwards, their usual walk. Nothing out of the ordinary. Now, once they were deep enough into the woods, Alexander told him what he wanted to do. That he wanted to find someone, and he wanted to kill them. And just like that, the illusion shattered. Because the person standing in front of him didn't see it the same way. There was no shared understanding, no agreement that came after. This was no game, just a lot of confusion. And in that moment, Alexander realized something. He wasn't understood, they weren't connected like he thought, and he was still alone with what he was thinking. And something in him snapped. When his friend turned his back, that was it. That was the moment everything started. What happened next was sudden, violent, and completely one-sided. Alexander grabbed a hammer that he had in his back pocket and struck him from behind. There was no struggle, no chance for him to react, and just like that, the line had been crossed. Now, what happened afterwards is just as important, because Alexander didn't panic. He didn't take off running or call for anyone's help. Instead, he had to decide what to do next. And that's where something clicked. Out in the park, hidden beneath the ground, was something most people would never think twice about. There was a network of sewer wells, and inside the park were a ton of openings that dropped down into Moscow's underground system. Deep, dark, and fast-moving. To Alexander, they weren't just part of the environment anymore, they were the solution. A way to make a body disappear, so he used it. And in doing that, he didn't just commit his first murder, he had figured out how to get away with it. There was no witnesses, no immediate evidence, and no reason for anyone to come looking. At least, not right away. But then, something happened. A few days later, police showed up at Alexander's door. Not because they knew what he had done, but because the person he was last seen with was now missing. And for most people, that would have been the moment everything fell apart. The moment panic sets in and reality hits. But for Alexander, it was something else entirely. He lied convincingly, he stayed calm, and just like that, it worked. No evidence, no pressure, and no reason for police to push further. So they left. And Alexander was left standing there, freely. And in that moment, everything changed. Because now it wasn't just a thought or a one-time act. It was proof. Proof that he could do this and walk away from it. And that feeling, that rush, came back stronger than ever. He would later actually describe it like something he had been searching for, like something that finally made sense to him. So now, he had everything he needed. The act, the method, and the confirmation that he could get away with it. And that's the moment this really stops being just one bad decision. Because now he knows that he can do this, and nothing happens. Once someone figures that out, that's when it stops being an impulse and starts becoming something a lot more dangerous. After that first murder, he didn't stop. At least not in the way you might expect. From the outside, it actually looked like life had just gone back to normal. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and nothing about Alexander really stood out. He was still going to work, still moving through the same routines, and blending into the background like he always had. But that feeling, that rush that he had experienced, it didn't go away. It stayed with him. And over time, it started to come back, stronger. And when it did, he went back to the one place where everything had already worked out in his favor once before. Bittsevsky Park. But this time, it wasn't just an idea anymore. He already knew what to do. He knew how to approach people, how to gain their trust, and how to make everything feel normal. It would usually start the same way. A conversation, he'd offer to sit and drink, something casual, something harmless. And then, slowly, he would lead them deeper into the woods, away from the paths, away from anyone who might notice. And once they were far enough, that's when it would happen. The method never changed. He would strike them from behind, and then use the same solution he had discovered the first time. The hidden sewer wells throughout the park. They gave him exactly what he needed, a way to make people disappear. And because of that, there was nothing tying these cases together. No witnesses, no clear timeline, no immediate reason for anyone to suspect what was actually happening. Just people who were there one day and then gone the next. Most of the people he targeted were vulnerable. Some were men he had already spent time around, the people he had been playing chess with in the park. Others were individuals struggling with alcohol, or people he simply believed wouldn't be missed right away. And that choice wasn't random. It made things easier, quieter, really less likely to draw attention. And with each time he did it, that confidence grew, because nothing was happening. No one was coming for him. So slowly, what started as something impulsive started turning into something structured. Back at home, he had a chessboard, and after each murder, he would mark it. One square for every life he had taken. At first, it might have just been symbolic, a way to keep track, but over time, it started to become his goal. 64 squares, a full board. And in his mind, that meant something. Completion, recognition, and proof, not just that he could do it, but that he could do it more than anyone else. And that's when things really started to shift. Because now, this wasn't just about the feeling anymore. It wasn't just about that rush. It was about building something, one move at a time. And as the board started to fill up, he became more comfortable, more controlled, and eventually more bold. But the system itself at this point never changed. The park, the method, the disappearance. And because of that, he kept getting away with it, again and again and again. And this is the part that really stood out to me. This wasn't something chaotic or reckless. It was very controlled, repeated, and happening in the same place, the same way, over and over again. And still, no one stopped him. For all the control he had built, and for how carefully everything had been working, cracks started to form. Not all of his victims disappeared. Some of them actually survived. And one of the most important moments in this entire case came from someone who was never supposed to make it out. A young woman named Maria. Unlike many of his earlier victims, Maria wasn't someone who would go unnoticed. She had a life, responsibilities, and at the time of the attack, she was pregnant. Alexander approached her differently. He knew the usual approach wouldn't work, so instead, he gave her a reason to trust him. He told her that he had found something valuable hidden out in the woods, something they could split if she helped him move it. And for Maria, that meant something. So she went with him, out into the park, away from everything familiar, and at first, it didn't feel wrong. Just a walk, just a conversation, until they reached the spot. He had led her towards one of the sewer openings, lifting the cover and gesturing for her to look. And in that moment, when her attention shifted, he moved, sudden and unpredictable. He tried to force her down into the opening, but this time, it didn't go the way he expected. Maria fought back. She held on to the edge, she resisted, and for a moment, everything he had been controlling so carefully fell apart. It wasn't quiet anymore. It wasn't calculated. It was chaotic. And he was struggling. Eventually, he did overpower her, believing he had done what he came there to do. So he left. But Maria didn't die. Down in the darkness, she survived. Injured, disorientated, trapped in a place no one was meant to come back from, and somehow she kept going. She moved through the tunnels, fighting to stay above the water, holding on to anything she could for hours, until eventually she found something. She found a ladder, and with everything she had left, she climbed. Reaching the surface, barely able to move, but she was alive. And when she finally got help, she told them everything. She gave him his name, who he was, and exactly what he had done, and exactly how it happened, and nothing came from it. And part of the reason for that wasn't just negligence. It was because of who Maria was. Unfortunately, Maria didn't have the proper documentation to be living in Moscow at the time. And because of that, her story wasn't treated in the way that it should have been. It wasn't pushed or followed up. And instead of focusing on what she was saying, the focus shifted to whether she should have been there in the first place or not. And because of that, Alexander stayed free. But it didn't stop there. There was others. At least one more survivor, a young boy who had an encounter with Alexander that should have changed everything. He had been approached in a way that felt familiar, casual, nothing immediately threatening, an offer, a conversation, something that didn't raise any real alarms right away. And like so many others, he ended up being led towards the park. And at some point, everything shifted. Without warning, he was attacked, struck in the head, disorientated, barely able to process what was happening, and then dragged towards one of the sewer openings. Alexander tried to push him in, but this time something went wrong. As he fell, his clothing caught on part of the edge, and instead of disappearing into the sewer like others, he was left hanging there, injured and unconscious, but not gone. And when he came to, he was still alive. Somehow, he managed to pull himself free, and then he ran, shaken and injured, trying to make sense of what just happened. But he was alive, and he did exactly what you would expect. He went straight to the police. He told them everything, what had happened, who had done it, even what he looked like. But his story wasn't taken seriously. Whether it sounded too extreme, or they just didn't believe him, or whether they simply just didn't see it as something worth pursuing, nothing came from it. But what makes this even harder to ignore is what came after it. So not long after, that boy saw Alexander again, by chance. And this time, he pointed him out directly to a police officer. And still, nothing happened. No arrests, no real investigation, nothing. And with each of these moments, each missed opportunity, something changed in Alexander. Because now, he wasn't just getting away with it. It was that he was being given chances over and over again. And every single time, nothing happened. And that belief started to grow stronger in him. He wasn't just lucky or just careful. He now was starting to believe he was untouchable. What was happening wasn't impossible to see. There were people who survived him, people who spoke up, even people who tried to tell someone what was happening. And still, it wasn't enough. Those are the parts of these cases that really stick with me the most. It's not just that he was doing these things, it's how many chances there were to actually stop it. But none of these opportunities did anything. And eventually, getting away with it wasn't enough anymore. For years, Alexander had been killing in silence. People disappeared, and for the most part, No one really understood why. No one knew who was behind it. No one knew that the same man walking through the park, sitting at chess tables, going to work, and living his regular life was also using that same park as a hunting ground. And for a while, that silence worked in his favor. But the thing is, silence doesn't give any recognition. Silence doesn't make people afraid of you. Silence doesn't build the kind of legacy Alexander seemed to crave. Because by this point, it wasn't just about the act itself anymore. It wasn't just about the rush, that feeling he got from killing. It started to fade faster. It wasn't enough to simply do it and walk away. He wanted people to notice. He wanted the world to understand that someone was out there doing this. And in his mind, he wasn't just killing people, he was building something. A number, a goal, a full chessboard, 64 squares. One square for every life he believed he had taken. And if he could fill that board, then in his mind, there would be no ignoring him, no brushing him off, no mistaking him for some quiet, ordinary man who stocked shelves and faded into the background. So eventually, he changed the way he operated. He stopped relying only on the sewer wells to make people disappear. Instead of hiding the evidence, he started leaving victims where they could be found. Just out in the open. In the park, in places someone would eventually stumble across what he had done. And with that shift came something else. A signature. The victims were still being attacked in a very similar way, but now he began leaving objects behind in a way that made the cases impossible to ignore. Most often, it was a vodka bottle. And this is where the case takes this really disturbing turn, because now it feels like he isn't just trying to get away with it anymore, he's trying to be recognized. He's creating something people can connect. Something investigators and the media would look at and say, this is the same person. And that is exactly what happened. Once bodies started being found in the park, the fear changed. Before, people were disappearing quietly. Families might have been worried, neighbors might have had suspicions, but there wasn't this obvious public pattern. But now there was. The same park, similar injuries, similar details, the same feeling that something very wrong was happening in a place people once used to escape the city. And slowly, Bittsevsky Park stopped feeling like it was just a park. It became a place people whispered about. The media started picking it up. Stories spread. People began talking about a killer in the area, the Bittsevsky Park maniac. And once that name started circulating, the fear became bigger than the crimes themselves. People avoided the park completely. Rumors spread through the community. Some thought maybe it was someone mentally unwell who had escaped from the nearby hospital. Others wondered if organized crime was involved, and nobody really knew. They just knew people were being found in the woods, and whoever was doing it was still out there. And while all of that was happening, Alexander was still there. Still going to work, still talking to coworkers, still living with his family. Even walking through the same neighborhoods as everyone else. Just hiding in plain sight. But now, he had something he didn't have before. Attention. Even if no one knew his name yet, they knew his work. They knew there was someone out there. They were afraid of him. And for someone like Alexander, that seems to have fed something in him. Because once he started to being seen, even indirectly, he became more confident, more reckless, more willing to take risks. And that's where the case starts to spiral. Because when someone is hiding, they're careful. But when someone wants credit, when someone wants the world to know they exist, they start making mistakes. And Alexander was getting closer and closer to making one big enough that even the police couldn't ignore it. In July of 2006, Alexander asked a coworker to go for a walk. Her name was Marina. They worked together, knew each other well enough that nothing about the invitation felt out of place. He wasn't acting strange. There was no warning signs, no sudden shift in behavior that would make someone step back and think twice. If anything, it felt like something simple, normal. Just two coworkers going for a walk after work. And honestly, that's one of the things that makes this moment so hard to sit with. Because for Marina, this wasn't a risk. It was just part of her day. But something about everything happening around the city had started to settle in the back of people's minds. By this point, bodies had already been found in the park. Stories were spreading. There were rumors of a killer. Someone targeting people in the area. It wasn't confirmed. It wasn't clear, but it was there. And whether it was instinct or just a small moment of caution, before she left to meet him, Marina did something that would end up changing everything. She wrote a note. She left that note for her son, explaining where she was going, who she was going with, and even included Alexander's name and phone number. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a declaration that she felt she was in danger. It was just a precaution. The kind of thing someone does without thinking too deeply about it. But that one decision became the turning point in this entire case. So Marina and Alexander met up and made their way towards the park. At first, everything unfolded exactly the way it had for so many of his other victims. They talked, they walked. Nothing felt rushed or forced. There was no obvious moment where things shifted on the surface. Until they were deep enough into the woods. At some point they stopped, sat down, shared a drink, just like he had done so many times before. And during that moment, Marina mentioned the note. Whether she meant it as a joke or something more serious isn't completely clear. But she said it out loud. She told him that someone knew where she was and who she was with. And from that point on, this wasn't going to end the way it usually did. When she turned away from Alexander, even for a second, that was all it took. He attacked her. And unfortunately, just like the others, he left her in the park. But this time, she didn't just disappear. When Marina didn't come home, her son knew something was wrong. He had the note, he knew exactly who she had gone to meet, and where they were supposed to be. So instead of waiting, instead of hoping she would just show up later, he acted. He called Alexander, and Alexander did what he had done before. He lied, calmly, confidently, without hesitation. He claimed he hadn't seen her, that he didn't know where she was, and that he hadn't even been with her. But this time, it didn't matter, because there was something to follow. Police were contacted, and once they started looking into it, things began to move quickly. They searched the park, and it didn't take long before they found her. From there, they started retracing her steps, looking at timelines, checking surveillance, and eventually they found footage of the two of them together heading towards the park. For the first time, there wasn't just a pattern of missing people or bodies being discovered. There was a direct connection. This was a person, and it led straight to him. Police went to his apartment, and when they got there was no resistance. No attempt to run, no sign that he was going to fight what was happening. He went with them without making a scene. Now, what they found inside that apartment changed the entire scale of the case. There was a chessboard, 64 squares, and most of them were marked. At first, it didn't fully make sense. It looked strange, unsettling, but not immediately clear. Just a board with markings that didn't seem to belong there. Until Alexander started talking. And when he did, everything got worse. He didn't just admit to the murders they were already investigating. He told them there were more. Not just a few, dozens. And not in a vague or uncertain way. He described them in detail, where they happened, how they happened, who they were. Enough detail that investigators couldn't just dismiss it as exaggeration or an attempt to seem more dangerous than he was. And as they began to follow up on what he was saying, they started finding connections, cases that matched the descriptions, disappearances that had suddenly made sense, pieces that had never been connected before, now falling into place one by one. What they initially believed was a killer responsible for a small number of victims began to unravel into something much larger. Because this wasn't just one case, it was years of them. And that's what makes this moment hit as hard as it does. Because after everything, after the survivors who came forward, after the reports that were ignored, after all the chances there were to stop him earlier, it wasn't some massive breakthrough or complex investigation that finally ended it. It was a note, one small decision, one moment where someone trusted their instincts. And that's what finally led police to him. But even then, as everything was being uncovered, as the scale of what he had done became clearer and clearer, it didn't feel like things were being wrapped up. If anything, it felt like the opposite. Because the more he talked, and the more investigators dug into his past, the more it became clear that what they had just uncovered was far bigger than anyone had originally thought. And in a lot of ways, they were only just beginning to understand it. Now, by the time everything was said and done, the numbers still didn't fully add up. Officially, he was convicted of 49 murders. That's what investigators could prove, what they could tie directly to him through evidence and timelines. But according to him, that wasn't the full story. He claimed there were more, over 60, and that number has always kind of existed in this strange space between fact and possibility. Because on one hand, he gave details, real details that led investigators back to cases they hadn't even connected yet. But on the other hand, it also felt like that number meant something to him. Like it wasn't just about what he had done, but how it would be seen, how he would be remembered. When you look back at everything, the chessboard, the way he marked each victim, the idea of filling all 64 squares, it's hard not to see that as part of it. It starts to feel less like he was telling the truth and more like he was shaping something, building a version of himself that fit his goal. And that's where things get complicated, because there are cases connected to his name that were never fully confirmed. One of the more talked about ones is a man who fell from a balcony in his apartment building. According to Alexander, he was responsible. He claimed he pushed him after some kind of conflict. But officially, it was ruled a suicide. And that leaves you in this uncomfortable spot where you're trying to figure out what to do with that. Is that another victim that never got properly investigated? Or is that him adding to the story, adding to the number because it fit the image of what he was trying to build? And the truth is, there isn't a clean answer. But even if you strip all of that away, if you ignore the claims and maybes, the numbers that can't be confirmed, you're still left with something that should have been stopped long before it ever reached that point. There were survivors. People who went to the police, explained exactly what happened, gave descriptions, and even gave his name, and nothing came from it. There were moments where things didn't line up, patterns that could have been seen, points where something should have clicked, and it didn't. And that's the part that really sticks with me. Not just what he did, but how many chances there were for it to end sooner. How many moments existed where things could have gone differently if someone had just taken one more step, asked maybe one more question, or taken one report a little more seriously. Because in the end, It wasn't some massive breakthrough that brought everything together. It wasn't some perfect investigation that finally solved it. It came down to one small decision. One moment where someone trusted their instincts. Just enough to leave something behind. A note. And that's what finally led police to him. And even then, when everything was uncovered and the scale of what he had done became clear, it didn't really feel like things were neatly wrapped up. If anything, it felt like the opposite. Because the more he talked, the more investigators dug. The more it became obvious that there were still gaps, still pieces missing, still things that didn't fully fit together. And maybe that's what makes this case stick the way it does. Because for everything we know, for everything that's been confirmed and documented, there's still that lingering feeling that we actually don't know all of it. Thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate you sticking through this one with me. If you're into deep dives like this, real cases, unsettling stories, things that just don't quite sit right, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. And if you have any thoughts on this case or anything that stood out to you, let me know down in the comments below. I do try to read them all. And as always, stay curious, stay brave, and stay spooky. See you next time.